A few years ago, I spent about 3 weeks traveling through a part of Europe that I'm not going to name. The country has a lot of military history, especially from both world wars. And if you're interested in old structures and abandoned places, you run into remnants of that history everywhere. I've always liked exploring old buildings, not in the social media influencer sense where people climb cranes and trespass for views. I was being interested in old construction, how things were built, what materials were used, how places changed over time. My grandfather worked construction his entire life, and I grew up listening to him talk about concrete, drainage systems, foundations, and all kinds of things that most kids probably would have found incredibly boring. For some reason, I loved hearing about it. While I was traveling, I became friends with a local guy named Tomas. Not his real name, obviously. He was probably around my age and worked as an electrician. We ended up talking for almost an hour and exchanged numbers. A couple of days later, he messaged me asking if I wanted to see something interesting that tourists almost never visited. I assumed it would be another fort, or maybe an abandoned factory. Instead, he told me about an old World War I bunker complex, hidden in a heavily wooded area in a small town. The place wasn't exactly secret. It showed up on some historical maps, but reaching it required a long walk through forest trails that most visitors never bothered with. According to him, locals knew it existed but rarely went there. We walked for like 50 minutes through the woods, birds everywhere, a few hikers on the main trail. The bunker was harder to spot. From a distance, it just looked like a low hill covered with vegetation. Only when we got closer did I start seeing sections of concrete emerging from the earth. Trees had grown around it over the decades, roots wrapped around walls, moss covered almost everything. The entrance was partially collapsed but still accessible. I was thinking how much smaller it looked than the massive military bunkers you see in documentaries. Tomas laughed and said everyone expected them to be huge. "Wait until you get inside," he told me. The moment we entered, the temperature dropped noticeably. The air smelled like wet concrete and stagnant water. My flashlight beam caught patches of moisture running down the walls. The corridors were surprisingly intact. There was graffiti here and there, but much less than I expected. Most of the bunker consisted of narrow hallways connecting small rooms that had once served different military purposes. We walked around taking photos and talking about construction methods. There were sections where old metal fixtures were still attached to the walls, rusted beyond recognition, but somehow still hanging there. I found myself wondering how many people had stood in those exact hallways over a century earlier, just as a historical thought. After 20 minutes underground, we reached an intersection where several corridors branched off in different directions. That was the first time I heard something I couldn't explain. It sounded like someone laughing, like a single person quietly laughing somewhere in the distance. I looked at Tomas. He looked at me. "Did you hear that?" I asked. "Yeah." There were multiple entrances to the bunker complex. We knew that. Our assumption was that another group of explorers had entered from somewhere else. That made perfect sense. The sound had echoed strangely through the tunnels, making it impossible to determine direction. We kept walking. A few minutes later, we heard footsteps. Not especially alarming. The bunker had concrete floors. Sound traveled extremely well. The footsteps seemed to stop whenever we stopped. I mentioned it to Tomas. I've explored old structures before, and acoustics can absolutely play tricks on you, but something about it felt odd. Several times we would pause to look at something and hear what sounded like a person moving somewhere deeper in the bunker. Then silence. Then movement again after we started walking. I even called out. The place was a maze. Whoever else was down there might not have even understood English. We continued deeper into the complex. The bunker was larger than it appeared from outside. Passageways connected to rooms that connected to more passageways. Sections were partially flooded. Others had collapsed ceilings that forced us to turn around. I started noticing that I hadn't seen any recent signs of visitors. That didn't necessarily mean nobody else was there. It just stood out because abandoned places usually accumulate evidence of visitors pretty quickly. The next thing we heard was harder to explain. We were standing near what looked like an old storage room when I heard faint voices. I thought Tomas was talking, but he was looking at me. I couldn't understand a single word. Neither could Tomas. It wasn't English, and it wasn't a language I recognized. That doesn't mean much because I only speak one language fluently, but it sounded conversational, lasted like 15 seconds, then disappeared. We both listened. I asked Tomas if there were homeless people who used the bunker. He said not usually. The location was too inconvenient. That didn't mean impossible. People can end up anywhere. We discussed turning around, but neither of us felt threatened. All we had experienced were some unexplained sounds in a large underground structure. There were explanations, but I just had the growing feeling that somebody else was in the bunker and didn't seem interested in making contact. That bothered me more than any ghost story ever could. The further we went, the less natural light reached us. Eventually, our flashlights became the only meaningful source of illumination. We entered a room with several old ventilation openings near the ceiling. Tomas spent a few minutes examining some rusted metal components while I wandered toward the far side of the room, and I heard what sounded like somebody walking above us. I looked up. The ceiling was solid concrete. The footsteps crossed from one side to the other. I was saying, okay, now that's weird. Tomas, for the first time all day, he seemed uncomfortable. He explained that there were sections of the bunker built at different elevations, and it was possible the sound was traveling from another corridor. After that, we started making our way toward a section he hadn't explored in years. According to him, it eventually connected to another entrance located much farther away on the opposite side of the hill. Very few people used that route because reaching it required a difficult hike through dense terrain. The corridor leading there felt different from the rest of the bunker, less damaged, less graffiti, almost untouched. I remember seeing that even the dust seemed undisturbed in places. The hallway eventually opened into a sequence of small rooms connected by narrow doorways. Most were empty. A few contained collapsed debris. One had an old metal frame of some kind lying against the wall. We moved slowly through them, shining our lights into corners as we went. Then we entered another room, and I happened to swing my flashlight toward the back corner before Tomas stepped inside. A person standing there, an old man, completely naked, facing the corner. The sight of him hit me so unexpectedly that I physically jumped backward. My flashlight jerked upward and the beam bounced across the ceiling before I pointed it back toward the corner. The figure was still there. I remember seeing pale skin, a thin frame, and what looked like gray hair around the sides of his head. He was standing inches from the wall with his shoulders hunched. I immediately called for Tomas. "There's somebody in here." Tomas stepped through the doorway behind me. I pointed directly at the corner, kept my flashlight fixed there. Then I glanced toward Tomas as he came beside me. When I looked back, the corner was empty. I thought I had somehow lost sight of the person in the flashlight glare. I moved the beam around the room. Nothing. The entire corner was bare concrete. Tomas looked confused. A man. What man? An old guy. I walked closer despite every instinct telling me not to. There wasn't really anywhere to hide. The room was small. The walls were solid concrete. There were no alcoves, no furniture, no debris large enough to conceal a person. The corner where I had seen him was empty. My brain refused to accept what I was seeing, or rather, what I wasn't seeing. Tomas asked me to describe the person. An elderly man, no clothes, facing the wall. The whole thing had lasted only a few seconds, but it had felt incredibly real. I can still picture it now. The shape of the shoulders, the pale skin, the posture. He never turned around. Tomas looked into the corner himself and then examined the rest of the room. He pointed out something that I already knew. There was technically another route into that section of the bunker. The distant entrance he had mentioned earlier. If somebody had entered from there, they could theoretically have reached the room without us noticing. The problem was that there wasn't enough time. Even if the man had immediately moved the second I called out, there was nowhere nearby for him to disappear. We checked every connected room. The entire area had become completely silent. What made it worse was that the room itself wasn't especially dark. My flashlight was powerful. The room wasn't huge. I had seen something standing there. Whether it had been a real person or not was the part I couldn't explain. For the next 10 minutes, we searched nearby passages, enough to satisfy ourselves that nobody was immediately nearby. We found no evidence of another person, no backpacks, no clothing, no camping supplies. I think anyone who's experienced something unsettling knows that feeling. As we headed back through the bunker, we heard more noises. At one point, we heard someone walking in another corridor. A few minutes later, there was another brief burst of quiet conversation somewhere in the distance. Again, neither of us could identify the language. The voices were soft, conversational. They never seemed to get closer. They were always distant, always impossible to locate. We reached one of the larger corridors near the entrance section. The atmosphere immediately felt different because natural light was visible again. There was a possibility that a real person was down there. An unknown person wandering through underground tunnels while apparently avoiding contact. We left. You know, the only difference was the old man. Tomas obviously hadn't seen that himself. He only saw my reaction. I looked at maps of the bunker a few times. I found references to secondary entrances and connected tunnels, which only complicated things further. Could somebody have used one of those routes? Could they have disappeared as quickly as whatever I saw seemed to disappear? If you had removed the old man from the story, I wouldn't even be telling it today. We would have simply been two people exploring an old bunker and hearing unexplained sounds. That happens in abandoned structures. People can misinterpret visual information. But even knowing all of that, I still struggle with what happened. I've considered every explanation I can think of. This happened when my girlfriend and I were still in high school. We had been dating for a while and spent a lot of time finding random places to walk because neither of us had much money and we were both too young to drive. There was an abandoned railroad line not far from where we lived that cut through woods behind an old industrial area. The tracks hadn't been used in years. A lot of the wooden ties were rotting, sections of rail were covered with weeds, and small trees were already growing between parts of it. People occasionally walked there even though it wasn't really a trail. If you knew where to enter, you could follow the tracks for miles without seeing many roads or houses. We used to go there on weekends. One afternoon, we decided to walk out there. We entered the railroad near an old gravel road and started walking along the tracks. The woods on both sides were pretty dense in some places. You could occasionally see old utility poles running alongside the line. Some had fallen over years earlier and were covered in vines. There were also scattered pieces of rusted metal and old railroad equipment that had probably been abandoned decades before. At one point, we found a faded railroad marker sticking out of the weeds and spent a few minutes trying to guess how old it was. My girlfriend took pictures of it with a cheap digital camera she carried everywhere back then. We talked about school, summer jobs, and completely unimportant stuff that I can't remember anymore. The tracks curved gradually through the woods. Every now and then, we would hear birds or squirrels moving around. After we'd been walking for a while, my girlfriend looked behind us and said there was somebody back there. I turned around and saw a man walking on the tracks, a few hundred feet behind us. There was nothing particularly strange about that. We weren't the only people who ever walked there. The railroad stretched for miles, and sometimes you'd run into people hiking, riding bikes, or just wandering around. The thing that eventually caught my attention wasn't the fact that he was there. It was that the distance between us never seemed to change. Normally, when someone is moving faster or slower than you, you notice it after a while. Either they get closer or they fall farther behind. This man stayed almost exactly the same distance back for a surprisingly long time. I checked a few times over the next 15 or 20 minutes. Every time I looked behind us, he was still there. The woods in that area weren't completely flat. There were stretches where the railroad sat on a raised bed above the surrounding terrain. Because of that, there were places where you could see pretty far down the tracks. Every time we came through one of those sections, I could still spot him. She said, "That's weird." Whenever we stopped for a minute to drink water or look at something, he seemed to stop too, but he never continued closing the distance. The man looked like he was somewhere in his 40s or 50s. His shirt looked stained and his jeans were covered in mud. I thought he might be homeless and living somewhere in the woods. Eventually, we reached an area where the tracks crossed a shallow creek. Most of the railroad bridge had been removed years earlier, but parts of the structure were still there. We stopped for a few minutes and sat on some large rocks near the water. The man was still behind us. I remember looking back toward the tracks and seeing him standing farther down the line. I don't know how long he'd been standing there because I hadn't been paying attention continuously. My girlfriend asked, "Why is he just standing there?" I told her I didn't know. As soon as we started moving again, he started walking again. I stopped assuming it was a coincidence. I started thinking we should head back sooner rather than later. We continued another quarter mile or so because we knew there was a clearing ahead where we could turn around comfortably. When we reached it, we stopped. The clearing wasn't very large. Years earlier, some trees had been cut down near the tracks, leaving an open area covered with grass and brush. I looked back and could still see the man. He was closer than before. "Let's just head back." I agreed. The problem was that turning around would mean walking directly toward him. For a second, we considered cutting through the woods and taking a different route back, but neither of us knew the area well enough to do that. The railroad was the easiest way out. I remember saying, maybe we'd just step off the tracks and let him pass us. If he was simply walking in the same direction, he'd go by and we'd continue home. So we waited. The man kept approaching. His clothes were in worse shape than I thought. His face looked dirty. His hair was messy and uneven like it had been cut with scissors by somebody. He didn't seem focused on where he was going. He kept looking at us. When he got within like 100 feet, we stepped off the tracks and stood to one side. He slowed down. Then he looked toward the woods. He stepped off the railroad and disappeared between the trees, vanished into the woods without any obvious reason. My girlfriend asked if we should leave. I said yes. We started walking back the way we had come. Walked quickly but not quite running. After a few minutes, we both relaxed a little. The tracks stretched ahead of us. We kept walking. We had just reached a section where the railroad curved through thicker woods. Visibility wasn't great because brush and young trees had grown close to the tracks. Without any warning, something metallic slammed into the railroad ties a few feet in front of us. The sound was incredibly loud. I thought somebody had fired a gun because the impact echoed through the trees. The object bounced off the wood and landed in the weeds beside the tracks. I didn't understand what had happened. I heard crashing movement coming from the woods on our left. The man burst out of the trees. There was blood on him. I thought he'd been injured. My brain was still trying to make sense of the metal object that had landed near us. I only got a quick look at it before everything became chaos. It looked like some heavy, rusted piece of metal. The man came out of the trees moving fast, and what scared me wasn't just that he was running toward us. It was the way he was acting. His movements, they were jerky and unpredictable. He was yelling, but it wasn't anything I could understand. It wasn't words. The best way I can describe it is that he sounded like someone trying to imitate an animal. It sounds exaggerated, but that's what it reminded me of. There were these loud screams mixed with growls and strange noises that didn't sound like speech. It wasn't like somebody angrily shouting at us. It sounded completely different. My girlfriend grabbed my arm. I remember seeing blood on one of his forearms. There wasn't a huge amount of it, but there was enough to stand out against his skin. There also appeared to be blood around his left eye or above it near his eyebrow. Everything happened quickly, so I can't swear exactly where it was, but I distinctly remember seeing red around that side of his face. The image stuck with me because it made the situation feel even less understandable. He looked injured, dirty, and completely unpredictable. I didn't know what he was doing. He changed direction slightly and moved toward my girlfriend. Whatever his intentions were, I knew we needed to get out of there. We ran. We were sprinting down the tracks as fast as we could. I heard him behind us. I heard him screaming. My girlfriend was crying while she ran. She kept asking what he wanted, and I kept saying I didn't know. We ran and eventually looked back again. The man wasn't as close. I couldn't tell whether he had slowed down or whether we'd simply gained some distance. He was still making those noises. They weren't random screams. There was some kind of pattern to them. I still don't know what he was doing. The railroad crossed a small access road not too far ahead. That became my entire focus. I knew if we reached the road, there was a better chance of finding other people or at least getting away from the woods. My girlfriend nearly tripped on one of the railroad ties while running. I grabbed her arm and pulled her upright. When we reached the access road, the tracks behind us were empty. My girlfriend wanted to keep moving. We left the railroad and followed the road toward a more populated area. I looked behind us constantly. The adrenaline was hitting hard. My hands were shaking. We reached an area where there were houses nearby. Once other people were around, things started feeling slightly more normal. My girlfriend thought the blood near his eye looked fresh, like it had happened recently. I wasn't sure. To me, it looked partially dried, and I thought the metal object had come from the woods before he appeared. She was convinced he threw it while running out. Neither of us could remember exactly what the object looked like afterward. What remains perfectly clear for me is the feeling that he had been deliberately watching us for a long time before anything happened. If he'd simply been wandering through the woods, why stay behind us for so long? He seemed focused on us from the moment we noticed him. The whole thing became even stranger afterward because neither of us could find any logical reason for him to behave the way he did. There was no robbery attempt. He never demanded money, never said anything we could understand, never gave any indication of what he actually wanted. As far as I know, he simply appeared, followed us for miles, disappeared into the woods, threw something at us, charged out screaming, and then vanished again. Years have passed since then. My girlfriend and I eventually went our separate ways later in life for unrelated reasons. What's interesting is that neither of us remembers it as becoming less frightening over time. Usually embarrassing or scary memories shrink a little as you get older. This one never did. It became more unsettling because I'm old enough now to understand how vulnerable we actually were. To this day, that's still the most frightened I've ever been in my life. My dad and I used to take short camping trips together a few times a year, whenever he could get a couple days off. He liked fishing more than camping itself, and I mostly liked getting away from school and sleeping outside. We usually stayed in pretty ordinary public camping areas where there were marked sites, fire rings, and sometimes a bathroom building somewhere down the road. The trip I'm talking about took place at a campground in Michigan. I remember a lot of weird little details from that weekend because of what happened. My dad bought one of those foam coolers because the old cooler he'd brought started leaking melted ice into the back of his truck. There were a few other occupied sites scattered around, but they weren't especially close. We spent most of it fishing. I caught absolutely nothing, and my dad spent most of the afternoon making fun of my casting technique. There were other people around. It was getting dark. My dad and I had just finished eating. The fire had burned down quite a bit, and I was sitting in one of those folding camping chairs poking at the dirt with a stick. My dad was organizing some fishing gear, and I saw someone coming from the trees behind our campsite. Something seemed off about the way he was moving. He kept stopping. He would take a few steps, pause, look around, then continue. He looked dirty. His clothes were stained and wrinkled. The man eventually stepped fully into the campsite and stood near the edge of the firelight. The first thing he asked was whether we had any money. My dad said no. The man nodded like he expected that answer and then asked whether we had food. My dad wasn't the type of person who liked confrontations. He was cautious, but he generally tried to help people when he could. He told the man he could spare a couple hot dogs and some chips. The guy seemed extremely interested in the food. While my dad put together a small bag for him, the man kept talking. Most of what he said didn't make much sense. He would start one topic and then jump to something completely unrelated. I remember him mentioning a truck, then somebody stealing something from him, then a friend, then money again. His eyes kept moving around the campsite while he talked. At the time, I didn't understand why that bothered my dad. But years later, when we talked about it, he admitted that was the moment he started feeling uneasy. When my dad handed him the food, the man thanked him several times. Then he stood there awkwardly for another minute or two. My dad asked whether he was camping nearby. The guy pointed vaguely toward the woods and walked away. I remember asking who he was. My dad said he was just somebody having a rough time. I think he was trying not to worry me. The campground grew quieter as the evening went on. We stayed by the fire for another hour or so before getting ready for bed. Then, my dad suddenly stopped talking in the middle of a sentence. I remember this. He had been telling me a story about one of his coworkers. He just stopped. I looked up. He was staring past me toward the trees. I turned around and saw the man standing between two trees. He was just standing there. Most of his body was hidden in darkness, but I could see enough of him to know it was the same guy. My dad called out and asked if he needed something. The man didn't answer. He eventually stepped forward slightly and said he was just looking around. My dad told him we were turning in for the night. The guy nodded. Then he disappeared back into the woods. That wasn't normal. People don't stand silently in the dark watching strangers. After he left, my dad started cleaning up much faster than before. He checked the truck, made sure the cooler was closed, made sure our food was packed away. Then we got into the tent. I remember asking whether the guy was weird. My dad said, yeah, a little. The tent wasn't very large. It was one of those basic dome tents. I slept on one side and my dad slept on the other. Everything had been pretty normal up to that point, so when I suddenly woke up in the middle of the night, I didn't think much of it. I lay there, staring into the dark, wondering what had woken me. I heard voices outside. One of them was my dad. The other was the man. That got me sitting up right away. My dad was already awake and talking through the tent wall. The man sounded much closer than before. He was standing right outside the campsite. I remember hearing him say he needed help. My dad asked what kind of help. The man said something about a vehicle and somebody being hurt. The story kept changing. At one point it sounded like someone had crashed. Then it sounded like somebody was lost. Then it sounded like he needed help finding something. The details never stayed consistent. My dad asked where exactly this person was. The man gave a vague answer. The conversation went on for a few minutes. My dad said he was not leaving the campsite in the middle of the night. The man became irritated. My dad kept refusing. The more the conversation continued, the more obvious it became that something wasn't right. The man's speech seemed erratic. Sometimes he talked very quickly. Other times he paused for several seconds before responding. His words occasionally slurred together. Even at my age, I could tell he wasn't behaving normally. At one point he said something that made absolutely no sense in the context of the conversation. It was something about money and somebody owing him something. My dad told him again that he wasn't leaving the campsite. We heard him walking around outside, circling. My dad sat still. I remember him listening carefully. The footsteps would move away for a moment and then come back. It felt like a very long time. Everything suddenly escalated so fast that even now, some parts feel blurry. The side of the tent slammed inward violently. The fabric hit me in the shoulder. My dad immediately grabbed me and pulled me toward his side of the tent. Before either of us could react further, something hit the tent again. Somebody had kicked it. The whole structure shook. I remember hearing my dad yell at the man to get away from us. The guy started shouting back, but most of what he said was incoherent. I could hear words here and there, but I couldn't follow what he was talking about. I saw a flash of light through the tent fabric. A second later, there was another flash. My dad swore under his breath. Years later, he told me he recognized what he was looking at. At the time, I had no idea. The guy started yelling. His voice sounded different from earlier in the evening. Before that, he had mostly sounded confused and scattered. Now he sounded angry and agitated. I remember hearing him accuse my dad of things that made no sense. He kept jumping between topics the same way he had before. One moment he was talking about money, then he was talking about somebody stealing from him. Then he was demanding help again. My dad told me to stay low and stay behind him. I think he was terrified. But you're a parent and your kid is sitting next to you. You don't really have the luxury of sounding terrified. The man kicked the tent. The side wall folded inward. One of the poles partially collapsed. Camping tents aren't designed to withstand somebody deliberately attacking them. Everything shook. The object in the man's hand crackled again outside. I remember hearing my dad unzip part of a bag beside him. At the time, I didn't know what he was doing. My dad owned a gun. He had carried it during some camping trips before, particularly in remote areas. As a kid, I barely thought about it because it was always stored away and I almost never saw it. That night was one of the few times I ever did. He pulled it out and told the man very clearly to back away. The man started talking again. It was strange. He sounded friendly. He started saying that there had been a misunderstanding, that he wasn't trying to hurt anybody. My dad wasn't buying it. Neither would I if somebody had spent the previous few minutes kicking my tent in the middle of the night. I remember hearing my dad tell him to leave. The man kept talking. My dad told him again, raised his voice in a way I never heard growing up. The man finally moved away from the tent. We could hear him walking around the campsite perimeter for a while afterward, moving around. Every few moments there would be silence, then another sound from a different direction. It felt impossible to know where he actually was. The whole time I was trying to make sense of what was happening. That age I understood that adults could act strangely because of drugs or alcohol. Whatever the reason was, none of it made me feel any safer. Eventually the sound stopped. The problem was that neither of us knew whether he had actually left. After a long time, my dad quietly decided we weren't staying until morning. That sounds obvious, but leaving wasn't as simple as it sounds. The campground roads were dark. The man could have been anywhere, and we still didn't know whether he had actually gone away. My dad waited a little longer before making a decision. Then he told me we were packing up. I remember helping as quietly as I could while my dad kept watching outside. We used flashlights only when absolutely necessary. Most of the gear got thrown into the truck much less carefully than usual. Normally my dad was extremely organized when packing camping equipment. That night, everything got tossed wherever it fit. The tent itself was partially damaged from being kicked. One pole was bent, and one side had a tear where the fabric had stretched against the frame. Every shadow between the trees looked like a person. At one point, my dad suddenly stopped what he was doing and stared toward the woods. I remember my stomach dropping. I asked what he saw. He said he wasn't sure. To this day, I don't know if he actually saw something or not. We drove to a nearby town and ended up spending the rest of the night in a motel. The next day, my dad reported what had happened. Beyond that, I don't know many details. I know there were conversations with campground staff and eventually with other people who handled those kinds of situations, but my dad never went into specifics around me. Part of that was because I was a kid. Part of it was because there wasn't much for him to tell. The guy's identity was never something I learned about. I don't know whether he was living in the woods, wandering through the area, under the influence of something, suffering from some kind of mental health crisis, or all of those things at once. I've realized there are plenty of situations where you never get a satisfying explanation. Years later, when I was an adult, I asked him. I was curious whether my memory matched his. It turned out his memory was even worse than mine. He said nothing the man said made sense if you listened carefully. The details kept changing. The story kept changing. The reasons for needing help kept changing. My dad believed the man was trying to get him away from the campsite and away from me. As a kid, I mostly remembered the sparks from the device in the man's hand and the sound of the tent getting kicked. As an adult, I know, it was a taser.